Howdy folks, Little John, and this week's version of 5 on Friday. And this week we're getting a little bit of support from my own mix. This is Little John's vanilla bean bourbon. And brew aged on oak and vanilla bean. So, as I said, end of last year, this year we'd be looking to be a bit more support from Little John's own stocks, and I've got plenty of blends sitting over on the shelf. So today's the first official video with my own sponsorship. It's not too bad. Anyway, what I want to talk about today, this is a topic that's been brought up by a few people in the comments of the videos, and that is off flavours in beers, and what they are, what causes them, and how to avoid them. Now, I am not going into a massive long list of every off flavour and thing that can go wrong with your beer, and I'm not going to go into massive scientific depths on what causes it, but an overview on what they are, how they could get into your beer, how they're getting into your beer, and what you can do to stop it. So something's been unusual for me on the 5 for Friday. Normally this just runs off the top of my head with no great amount of planning, and goes where it goes. But today I've actually printed off a bit of a list of those off flavours. Main reason being, there's quite a few, and I didn't want to miss anything major, which can happen when you're just rolling along. And the other thing too is it's easy when you start talking about off flavours. It's not uncommon. Maybe it's just me, but I know you'll label something and you'll give a completely different. The diagnosis is, the breakdown of that will be for something else. So to avoid that issue, I've printed off a bit of a list so I can make sure I can touch on the main ones I want to, and not mix things up. I mean, you don't want to be, don't need any confusion when you're trying to work out what you do or aren't doing wrong. So, as I said, it's not an exhaustive list, and it's not really technical, but these are things that most brewers at some time will come across, and for a lot of it, it's mainly to do with grain brewing, but a lot of the flavours and off flavours and tastes that you can get in your beer are specifically fermentation related as well. So it's also relevant to kit and extract brewers as well. So the first one I look at, and one that creeps up quite a lot for people, and that's acetaldehyde. And that comes across as a green apple, rotten apple kind of smell. Can be like a bit of a baked pumpkin sort of a flavour. It's quite a common sort of a flavour that the brewers get, and the main cause or causes are brewing a higher alcohol beer, and not having enough yeast, or just in general not having enough yeast to ferment the beer that you're brewing. So it can be a 4% beer that hasn't got enough yeast, and it's basically it's a byproduct of yeast regeneration, and predominantly caused when the yeast is under stress. which is a result of low numbers where the yeast has to work harder to convert all the sugars. The way to avoiding it obviously is simple. Use a correct amount of yeast. So that means using a yeast calculator if you're going into the high gravity beers. If you're pushing into those high alcohol beers, get a calculator, work out what you need, make yourself starters, or use adequate numbers of packets of dry yeast to be well rehydrated. The other option with acetaldehyde is it will, to some degree, reduce in the bottle over time. It won't always reduce, and it will depend on the beer itself and the amount, but you can get it to drop just by letting the bottle sit. So if you do come across it, put your bottles aside, forget about them for 6 months, then come back and try again and see whether that's fixed the problem. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Now, similar one, and along the same sort of lines with yeast is Diacetyl, which comes across, it's like a butterscotch, buttery flavour, can be like a slick oil type feeling on the mouth across the top of the tongue. It's like sucking on a Werther's, which is generally referred to, but any of those sort of butterscotchy lollies, that sort of a flavour, and gives you that same sort of a feel. Now, it is a flavour that is chased to some degree in some European lagers. They do chase a little bit of diacetyl as part of the process, but generally speaking, it's not something you want really in your beer. It's not really a pleasant flavour, and it's not a pleasant feel in the mouth. Now, what causes it essentially is just, again, stress for the yeast. But where acetaldehyde comes from, the yeast working hard and stress from the alcohol content. It's more specifically the yeast itself to some degree. Now, a lot of it can often come from a lack of oxygen in your wort, from not enough air when you're starting, so the yeast is not multiplying enough initially, and it will create a lot of that diacetyl in those early stages. Certain kinds of yeast are more prevalent, so any of the high flocking yeasts, so you get that, now off the top of it, and I didn't look it up, but any of those yeasts that push into that 78 and 80% attenuation can be more prone to diacetyl due to their process of regeneration and when they're first pitched. So to avoid it, initially, as always, make sure you're pitching plenty of yeast, healthy yeast, so good starter, or enough dry yeast that's been well rehydrated. Okay, and the other thing that does work, and pretty much everyone's aware of, is a D-rest, a diacetyl rest, which should be a standard practice for anyone doing lagers. It's been touched about on videos, and that's just raising your temperature by 2, 3, 4 degrees towards the end of active fermentation to allow the yeast to really clean up anything that's left behind, because the yeast will reabsorb most of that diacetyl when it's allowed to be more active and when it's actually grown in numbers, which is what that diacetyl rest does. It gives that yeast time to get more active and clean up the stuff that's created once it's finished eating the sugars. Okay. The other thing is time. Just time of the fermenting. Just allow your ferment to sit for more than a day or two after it's reached stable gravity, once it's reached final gravity. And as I said, 4 to 7 days before you even process with a cold crash, or even looking at bottling. Give your ferment time to clean up those sort of flavours. Diacetyl will clean up a little bit in the bottle. The yeast can continue to work to eat it, but from my own experience, once it's in the bottle, if it's there, you're not getting rid of it. It's going to stay there. So it really focuses on the importance of making sure your fermentation process is done right. Now, like I said, going with the most common ones, cidery flavours. Now this is a big one, especially for new brewers particularly. You see it all the time. My beer's got a cidery taste. It's, you know, tastes like it's got a winey sort of flavour. Those flavours come from using too much simple sugar, for want of a better word, but basically white sugar, corn sugar, dextrose, white sugar, caster sugar. You know. Those simple sugars used in large amounts result in those sort of flavours. There's quite often is associated with that homebrew twang. Is quite often linked into that cidery sort of winey flavour, and it's a lot of where a lot of home brewers got a lot of trouble over the years with flavour. It's from using too much white sugar into plain sugar. You know, dextrose doesn't matter. Dextrose, table sugar, dextrose does refine. Will still going to cause the problems if you use a whole whack of it. Now, again, that's obviously recipe related and all and stuff like that, but it's clearly recommended to not use a lot of it in your brews. A couple of 100 grams in a standard 23 litre batch is about it. From a little bit of reading I was doing last night and this morning, a lot of recommendation is to be under 500 grams in a batch. Of those sort of sugars to avoid those flavours, and essentially saying that once you get beyond that sort of number, you're going to get an amount of those sort of flavours. Again, depending on the beer that you're brewing, a little bit of that can be, can be tolerable in the beer. Could even be, what you're after. But on a whole, it's not a flavour you want. It's not flavour that should be in beer, and it's not something that you really want. So how do you avoid it? Simple. Use malt, dry malt, mash grains, use liquid malt. It doesn't matter, but use less sugars. And as you see all the time, I recommend with the kit brew 1 kilo of dry malt, 200 or 300 grams of dextrose. They're the limits you want to be using those things. So limit your dextrose use, stick with your malt. Okay. You combine that sugar with an underpitch of yeast and a lack of oxygen, you're making a fairly nasty tasting beer. So again, it's a very common problem, and it's easy fixed, and it's easy to avoid. Next one is particularly concentrated and restricted to the grain brewers, and that's DMS, dimethyl sulfide, or dimethyl sulfide. DMS is a compound which is created in the malting process of the grain itself. The lighter the grain, the more of the DMS remains in the grain. It's created during the early stages of malting, and when it's heated to finish the process, the DMS is basically cooked out of the grain. So your lighter grains that don't cook for as long or at high temperature, it tends to stay in. Now, at this point in time, people will tell you constantly that you don't get DMS anymore, the malts are modified well enough that it doesn't exist. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. Bullshit. I've had enough brews to know that DMS is real. It does exist. I've used cheap Australian made lager malt. I've used Belgian lager malt, I've used quality German lager malt, and I've had it in all of them when I've not followed the right steps to allow for it. So it does exist, and for me, you're foolish if you're going into a brew on the basis that it doesn't and not allowing for it. What it will create in your finished beer is cooked vegetables, mostly cabbage, and I don't know too many people who really appreciate the experience of cooked cabbage, least of all when it's in your beer. It is not nice, it will destroy your beer, and it is not salvageable. You don't want it, you need to avoid it. So as to, it's caused simply by the malt itself. It's within the malt, or it's in the malt when you get it. There's nothing you can do about it, it is there. So to avoid it, you've got to take a few simple steps. It's simple. You need to boil your grain for 90 minutes. Now, when we're talking boiled grain, we're talking your lager malts, your lower malts. Anything that comes in that pale malt range as an ale malt is gone far enough that it should not affect it in any way. So Golden Promise, Marisol, yeah, stuff like that, and anything getting on a bit darker, you're not going to have a problem. But anything that's a lager malt, a Pilsner malt, I would assume even some of the distillers malts, which are a lower number, which obviously isn't going to get, people aren't using beer anywhere near as often. But those lighter malts, you have the potential for DMS to get into your final beer. So you need to do a 90-minute boil. You also need to ensure that you haven't got a lid on the boiler when it's boiling. Take the lid off, let it boil off. You've got to evaporate stuff off to get rid of the DMS. It evaporates off with the steam. If you've got a lid on it, it just gathers on top of the lid, condensates, and goes back into your liquid. It doesn't come out, it stays there. You know, if you need to cover a boil to keep it boiling, only half cover it and make sure the steam is getting away. Make sure avoid stuff dripping back into the kettle. Put a lid on an angle, whatever. But it can be avoided. Okay. As I said, I've had it, and the only times I've had it is when I've not followed the right methods and I've boiled a lager malt for 60 minutes. You know, I've never had, like once I have had DMS in a lager. I did a 90-minute boil. Yeah, and I think that may have been cheap malt at the time. But either way, only once in all the lagers I've done over the years have actually had DMS when I've followed the right steps. Okay, so make sure you're doing that. It's not worth, for half an hour of boiling, it's not worth losing a batch of beer. Okay, oxidation. Now this oxidation affects beers widely, and it's not the easiest thing to avoid. Now, oxidation in your beer will come through as a wet cardboard. Let's describe it as wet cardboard. It can be a little bit bitey. It can add a perceived increase in bitterness over what the beer should have. And you can generally smell it as well. It doesn't smell, it smells like it's a damp sort of a smell. Like I said, the wet cardboard is, if you just leave a pile of bloody papers and cardboards, they get wet and you leave them there for a week and you pull them out, they've got just that musty sort of smell. It's not good. And it simply comes from air getting into the beer. For the most part, post fermentation. There is still some conjecture as to hot side oxygenation. On a homebrew scale, it's really not too much of a concern. But once you get beyond a boil, you really don't want to be splashing your wort and introducing any oxygen. Sorry, once you get beyond the ferment. Plenty of oxygen at the start, let the yeast eat it all, and then you don't want to put any more back in. Okay, so gentle transfers if you're transferring from the fermenter. If you're going through secondaries, and this is why a lot of people don't like using a secondary, because you're increasing your risk, particularly of oxidation, every time you transfer the beer. It's very hard to transfer via a line without getting some amount of air into the beer. And I would say that 99% of brewers are getting oxygen of some level into their beer, whether it's kegged or bottled, as part of their process, because it's just all but impossible to avoid. But you need, if you minimise it, then the problem really doesn't exist. Secondary fermentation in the bottle will eat most of that, most of the oxygen, which does come in as part of the process, as long as you keep it to a minimum. So, as I said, simple to try to avoid. Gentle transfers, not a lot of, the least amount of splashing you can possibly do. If you're using hoses, ensure the hoses are sitting on the bottom of glasses or bottles, or the vessel, so it's not splashing. Don't run it down sides. Keep it restricted. Like when you're bulk priming, you're stirring, stir very gently. Don't splash when you're stirring. Now, they're your main ones that are going to come from process. You can get medicinal notes from mashing and using water that's too hot, or mashing for extended periods. And again, that's only that's an all grain thing, but by following a acceptable and reasonable mashing process with acceptable temperatures, we'll avoid having that sort of problem. Simply using the right temperatures and the right amount of times, and you are going to keep those medicinal notes out, and they come across like cough syrup and band-aids. And also ensuring that you're using the proper yeast. Good cell numbers, but the right yeast for the beer you're brewing. If you're using the wrong sort of yeast, you're going to get flavours which aren't right in that kind of beer, and depending on what it is, it can lead to a medicinal sort of a flavour. Can also come from cleaning, from using too much sanitizer. Sanitizer has been mixed incorrectly, leaving bleach residue in your fermenter or in your kegs and stuff like that. That can also lead to those medicinal flavours, because that will have an effect on the yeast, which then throws these flavours out. So making sure when you are making sanitizer, it's mixed correctly, and when you're using cleaning products, that they are rinsed thoroughly. Another one which is really yeast driven is estery notes. Now, estery notes are part of most ale yeast, fruit notes, and in certain beers they're wanted. The banana notes of a Weizen or of a Hef, wheat beers and certain ales, you're looking for that. But on the whole, you're getting those banana and covered with pear, grapefruity sort of notes that aren't meant to be there. It can be from the yeast, and it's basically just stressed yeast. Yeast being stressed, and generally by high temperature, running a yeast at a temperature higher than what it's liking. And again, depending on the style, as brewers we will push those levels on certain styles, because we're after those sort of effects from the beer. But overall, that's not flavours you're after. So keeping your yeast, the right yeast to the style you want, in healthy numbers and in the right temperature range, is going to avoid those things happening. Okay. Again, it's simple stuff. Another one is astringency, and again, it's it's a bitey, sharp edge on the tongue. Can often be associated to a really strong tea. It has the same sort of quality, astringency as bite, and it's, again, for the most part, is not a pleasant taste, and it's not what you're after in your beer. And it will generally come about through your mash temperatures. It can come from the grain itself, by particularly like darker grains can create astringency. So mashing your dark grains for a long period of time can create astringency. That's quite often why you'll see, I've done it myself with stouts and porters and things, where you can cold steep your grains overnight, or you can add them in quite late in the mash, so they're not in the temperature for too long. And a high temperature sparge can also do it. You'll often hear about extracting tannins from the grain. It's not a common thing in a homebrew setting, but it is well considered. That you start going beyond 85 degrees with your water, and you can start extracting tannins, which will give you astringency in your beer. Now, even if it's late into a sparge, you're not going to do a lot, but it can affect it. So it's simple. Again, correct temperatures in the mash. Doing good mashing steps. It's simple, following good procedure, and we'll avoid it. Chlorophenol, which is a plasticky vinyl sort of a taste, and that comes down to chlorine. And this is really one of the harder areas for brewers, because it's the one thing that's a little bit harder to control. You've got to use water that you've got available to you. It's not particularly economical to use bottled water or spring water, or for brewing. You use quite a lot of water, and it would make it very uneconomical. So for the most part, we're stuck with using our town supply, which in every case that I'm aware of has chlorine in it, and this is what causes these sort of flavours. So there are several ways of dealing with chlorine in your water. If your local supply is just using chlorine, then it takes nothing more than filling your tub with water the night before, or your bottles, leaving the lids off and just letting it air overnight. The chlorine will breathe off no problem. It doesn't take long at all. If you're in a location where you pour your water and you get that cloudy look, that's chlorine. It's just the gas stirring up when you pour the thing, and you let it sit, and it returns to normal. That's good. In that period of time, most of that chlorine's actually fizzed off. But when it's sitting reasonably still, it takes a bit longer. So overnight, and it's gone. If you're in an area which is using chloramine, which is becoming more and more popular, and you need to check with your local water source what they're doing, chloramine will not breathe off, but it will be removed by using vitamin C powder. As far as I've seen from my reading, other than a very sophisticated level of filtering, vitamin C, with ascorbic acid, in a powdered form, is about the only way you'll get rid of chloramine. It's very easy. Bag of vitamin C powder, it's not cheap, but you use like half a teaspoon in a 23 litre batch. Same thing, set your water out the night before, pop your vitamin C in. Next morning when you're ready, the next day when you're brewing, that chloramine's gone and your beer's fine, and the vitamin C will do nothing. It will not affect your beer in any way. You won't even know it's there. And to some degree, it's also believed it will do some good for your yeast. So again, simply fixed. Now, that's all I'm going to elaborate on. Now, there are a whole bunch of different flavours, like off flavours, which come around with your beer, and such descriptions as grassy, grainy, mouldy, salty, skunky, skunk, letting your beer sit out in the sun. soapy, sulphur, sour, sweet, yeasty, solvent. Yeah. The reality is most of those come down again to process, and it's simply a case of doing the right things to avoid them. Yeah. And yeah, it's like we're constantly discussing with brewing about, you know, doing the things that you need to do right to make good beer, and doing the things right avoids, yeah, you can avoid this crap. So using fresh ingredients, the best ingredients that you can. You know, everyone's budget is different, but you know, we've done the experiments, done the comparisons. You know, using cheap ingredients gets you a cheap product in the end. It's the same as anything. So, fresh ingredients, good quality. Using good processes. So that's being, you know, sanitation. Make sure your sanitation's up to scratch. Using the right sanitizers, using them in the right amounts, rinsing thoroughly and properly. Using the right amount of your product, where it's grain, using the right ratios, using the right amount of yeast, using your products at their healthiest. So if you are going with yeast, using your calculator to work out how much yeast you need, making a starter or using enough dry packets, rehydrating those dry packets so you're pitching plenty of healthy cells, ensuring that your wort is oxygenated, it's got plenty of oxygen to get going and get up and going, keeping your brew at the right temperature, and that's right through from mashing, mixing your products up, pitching your yeast, ensuring you're at the right temperature when you're pitching, keeping it at the right temperature during the ferment, and adjusting those temperatures as you go if you need to for, as I said, for lagers, for your diacetyl rest and things like that. Taking care when you're bottling that you're bottling safely, transferring well, you're using the right amounts of stuff when you are priming, and that your equipment's clean. Okay, and then keeping your finished beers in a good environment. Yeah. Don't sit them next to, don't sit in somewhere where they're going to get super hot. Avoid sitting somewhere they're going to get super cold. Handle them properly. They're valuable. It takes time and effort to make. Keep it somewhere where it's going to last. So when you want to drink it, it's at its best. Okay. It's a whole big bunch of things, but they're all just little steps along the way, and they're all things we should be doing on every brew. And it should be second nature. I mean, if you're just starting out, then you're learning these things. Take the time to learn them. But go back and have a look through the videos, through Brew School and through the 5 on Friday chats, even just the Brew Day videos. There's plenty of information there on pretty much every step and every process from start to finish that you need to know, that you can come back and have a look at and make sure you're doing the right things. Okay. At the end of the day, it's nothing worse when these little things stuff you brew up. So, as always, if you've got any questions, anything you want to clear up, or you want further information on, stick a question down the bottom. Ask away. Always happy to elaborate more on stuff if people need it. There's plenty of information out there. It's not always the easiest to find, and sometimes it can be conflicting. But it is out there. Ask around if you need to clarify stuff. If you haven't subscribed to Little John, hit the button down there. Get in there. Join us. We're doing stuff. We're learning things all the time. Okay. So that's me for today. It's probably dragged on. I haven't actually set my time, which I normally would, so I've got no idea how long I braved on. Probably for quite a while. Big topic. kept it as simple as I could without missing, you know, I believe without missing some vital information. So hopefully that's everything that people need, that you can avoid getting these nasties in your beers from now on. So that's me, Little John, for today. So until looking at you again, we're brewing beer, we're drinking beer, we're talking beer. Good brewing.